There's a detail buried in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, easy to miss, easy to dismiss. In the autumn of 865, a large Norse force landed on the eastern coast of England. They moved inland. They moved fast. And by the time local defenders had gathered enough intelligence to understand what was happening, the Danes had already stopped, dug in, and built something that would hold them for months. The Chronicle calls it a winter quarters. It offers no further explanation, as if the speed and competence of the thing required no comment. That silence is worth sitting with. Because what that army did, arriving in foreign territory, reading unknown ground, and constructing a functional fortified camp before darkness fell, was not luck. It was not instinct. It was a practiced, systematic process that the Norse and Danish warrior forces of the 9th and 10th centuries had refined over generations of raiding, campaigning, and surviving on the move. The 3-hour figure in the title is an approximation, not a documented stopwatch measurement, but it reflects something archaeologists and historians increasingly accept: that experienced Norse armies were capable of establishing defensible, organized camps with remarkable speed using methods that were both simple and deeply rehearsed. This is the story of how that worked, not the mythology, not the longships in the horned helmets, the actual physical process, the ground selection, the tools carried, the labor divided, the sequence followed. What a Norse army camp looked like from the inside, what it smelled like in the first hour after the march stopped, and why an army that had turned camp building into collective muscle memory was far more dangerous than its enemies understood. Start with the ground, because the ground was everything. A Norse warband approaching a halt did not simply stop and drop. The men who led these forces, jarls, experienced herseers, men who had campaigned across the North Sea, the Irish coast, the river systems of Francia, understood terrain the way a carpenter understands wood. The slight rise that drained rainwater away from sleeping men. The river bend that provided water access while limiting approach vectors. The field edge where the ground was firm enough to hold a post, but not so rocky that driving one would break an axe. This selection happened while the column was still moving. Scouts ranged ahead, and what they reported shaped where the march slowed, where it stopped, and which direction the first men began to orient themselves. Surviving accounts from Frankish chronicles, Irish annals, and the fragmentary English records of the 9th century describe Norse encampments consistently placed near water, on elevated or defensible ground, and frequently enclosed by some form of earthwork or palisade when the army intended to stay for more than a single night. The camp at Repton, excavated in the 1970s and 1980s by archaeologists Martin Biddle and Bertha Kjolby Biddle, showed evidence of a D-shaped earthwork enclosure built around an existing stone church, with the River Trent forming the fourth wall. That enclosure sheltered a substantial portion of the Great Heathen Army over a winter. It was not built from nothing. The Norse commanders used an existing structure as the anchor point. You don't carry what the landscape already provides. But even at Repton and at other confirmed or probable Norse campsites across England, the earthworks themselves had to be thrown up quickly. The question is how. The tools were simple, and they were carried. Every man in a Norse warband of any scale carried what he needed to keep himself alive. That included weapons: an axe, a sax, a spear for the majority of warriors, swords for those who could afford them. But it also included everything required to make camp: a length of rope, possibly a rolled section of canvas or oilskin, an eating knife, a small kit of personal effects wrapped in a skin or cloth pack. Many carried a hand axe that served double duty as a weapon and a felling tool. Some units, particularly in larger armies operating for extended campaigns like the Great Heathen Army, would have included dedicated support personnel, men whose primary role was not frontline fighting, but logistics, animal handling, and construction. The primary tool for rapid earthwork construction was the human body organized. Digging implements were limited and heavy. Not every man carried a dedicated spade. What replaced the spade, in many documented cases, was the turned sod, a technique that required bladed tools to cut turf and hands or simple wooden levers to shift it. Cut the turf in rectangular blocks, stack them, reinforced with woven branches or split timber, and you have a wall that is low, fast, and surprisingly effective. It will stop a rushing attacker long enough for the men behind it to respond. It creates psychological definition. Inside is organized, defended space. Outside is exposure.
That boundary matters enormously when you are sleeping in enemy territory. Timberwork followed a similar logic. The Norse were not cutting old-growth forest and milling planks on campaign. They were cutting what was nearby, quickly, and fashioning it into forms that require no precision joinery. Sharpened stakes driven into the outer edge of an earthwork berm, horizontal branches lashed between upright posts to create a fence that was more barrier than wall, larger upright timbers to anchor entry points where the camp could be opened for sortie or resupply. The Trelleborg-style camps in Denmark, the great circular fortresses at Agersberg, Heierkat, and Trelleborg itself, represent the sophisticated, permanent end of the Norse military construction, built at royal command with measured geometry. Campaign camps were the rough, fast, disposable end of the same tradition, the same underlying culture, a society that built in wood as naturally as it breathed. Division of labor was where the time compression happened. 300 men doing the same thing simultaneously is not efficient. 300 men doing 30 different things simultaneously, each group knowing exactly what its job is how you build a camp in 3 hours.
The Norse warband was not a conscript army dragged from the fields and told to march. The men who formed the core of major raiding and campaigning forces were experienced fighters who had, in many cases, been doing this since their mid-teens. They had made camp dozens, sometimes hundreds of times. The sequence was known. The roles were understood. When the column stopped and the decision was made to camp for the night or longer, the organization that followed was less a matter of received orders and more a matter of habit made collective. Some men immediately began perimeter work, walking the selected ground, placing markers, beginning the turf cutting or post setting that would define the camp's outline. Others moved to water. Fetching water was not a minor task. An army of several hundred men required a continuous supply, and the water carriers needed to identify the safest access point, assess the quality as best they could, and begin filling whatever containers the group carried. Simultaneously, fire was being established. Not one central fire, but multiple smaller fires distributed through the camp, which served both to warm men and to ward off the psychological weight of darkness in unfamiliar land. Finding dry tinder in autumn or winter England was its own small discipline. Men who had spent years on campaign developed a nose for it. The sheltered root of a fallen tree, the inner bark still dry under the rot, the dry grass compressed beneath a stone the rain had not fully reached. Shelter construction ran in parallel. The Norse did not, in most campaign contexts, haul heavy permanent tents across the sea in their longships. What they carried was minimal and multifunctional. Sails, or sections of them, could be rigged on poles as lean-to shelters. Animal skins served as ground cover and overhead protection. In forested terrain, branches and bark could be layered into rough sleeping covers that kept the worst of the rain off. In open ground, men slept in groups, sharing warmth with cloaks and whatever fabric they had wrapped tight. The cold in 9th century England was not abstract. October nights in the Midlands dropped to near freezing. A wet man sleeping on bare ground without shelter dies from exposure faster than he dies from a sword. The longship itself, when the camp was coastal or riverine, served as a literal shelter. Men slept aboard, using the hull as wind protection and the sail as a roof. When the army had moved inland beyond that option, the physical problem became more acute and the improvisation more visible. The perimeter was never an afterthought. This is perhaps the sharpest distinction between Norse campaign camp building and what a modern viewer might imagine from the image of raiders pulling up on a beach. The instinct for defense was not secondary to comfort or food, it was primary. The men who led these armies had watched comrades die in night attacks. They had seen what happened when a camp without a perimeter was hit by a determined local force at 2 a.m. The lesson was not learned once, it was absorbed into the culture of campaigning itself. The perimeter took different forms depending on time, terrain, and perceived threat. In a single night stop in relatively secure territory, it might be nothing more than a posted watch, men stationed at the margins of the camp, rotated through the night, whose job was to listen and wake the camp at the first sign of movement. In contested territory or when an army intended to hold ground for days or weeks, the perimeter became physical. The turf berm, the sharpened stake fence, the ditch cut in front of the earthwork to slow any rushing attacker by a few critical seconds. The ditch is worth noting specifically because it appears consistently in the archaeological evidence for known Norse campsites. At Repton, the earthwork incorporated a ditch. A ditch did not require sophisticated engineering.
It required men with cutting tools and the willingness to move earth in a short time. The spoil of the ditch went onto the inner bank, which is efficient. You are simultaneously deepening the obstacle and raising the wall with the same labor. A ditch 1 meter deep and 1 meter wide with a bank of similar dimensions behind it is a serious impediment to a night assault by men who were not expecting it. The watch system functioned alongside the physical barrier. What is clear from multiple sources is that Norse armies operating in hostile territory maintained active night watches. The Frankish monk who wrote the Annals of Saint Bertine noted with exhausted frustration that Norse forces around the Seine in the 860s were difficult to surprise, that they seemed always prepared, that attacks mounted with the hope of catching them asleep tended to find them already awake and armed. That observation was not a compliment offered freely. It was a military professional's acknowledgement that the enemy knew what it was doing. Food and fire in the first hours of camp were not luxuries, they were operational necessities. A man who marches for 6 to 8 hours carrying weapons, armor, and a pack, then spends 2 hours doing physical construction labor, needs calories. He needs them before he sleeps, because the body that goes to sleep without fuel does not recover the way the body that was fed does. Norse armies on campaigns sourced food in multiple ways: what they carried, what they foraged, and what they took from the surrounding population. Raiding parties were often sent out from a newly established camp within hours of its construction, not only to intimidate the local population, but to gather food, livestock, and portable goods. This was supply logistics with a violent edge.
What was carried tended toward the preserved and the calorie-dense. Stockfish, wind-dried cod that Scandinavian fishermen had been producing for centuries, was compact, high in protein, and resistant to spoilage. Hard bread, dried grain, smoked meat, hard cheese. These were foods that survived sea crossings and long marches without rotting. By the time the perimeter was established and the shelters roughed in, the fire was usually going and something was cooking. The smell of that, wet wool drying near flame, something fatty rendering in the heat, the resinous smoke of green wood that hadn't been given time to season, was the smell of a Norse camp settling into its first functional hour. Alcohol was present. Evidence from Scandinavian material culture and saga literature suggests that ale or mead was carried in quantity when logistically possible. This was not purely about morale. Alcohol in diluted form was often safer to drink than standing water in unfamiliar territory, a practical reality that medieval people understood by long experience. The social architecture of the camp mirrored the social architecture of Norse society itself. These were not egalitarian spaces. The Jarl occupied a more sheltered position, with his household warriors, his hird, positioned around him. Below them were the independent freemen who formed the bulk of most raiding armies, men who had come along because the risk was worth the reward, who owed loyalty to the leader but retained their own weapons and their own claim to a share of whatever was taken. At the margins were thralls and support personnel, whose place in the camp's geography reflected their place in its social order. This hierarchy shaped the physical layout. The leader's area sat toward the interior of the enclosure. Entry points were controlled by trusted men. The watch rotations were assigned by the men immediately below the Jarl, and violations, falling asleep on post, abandoning position, carried severe consequences in a military culture where such failures could get everyone killed. Men who had sailed and fought and camped together dozens of times developed the kind of wordless coordination that comes from shared repetition. They knew without being told which group handled what task. The 3 hours were not improvisation, they were execution. What made Norse armies so disorienting to their enemies was not the fighting itself, it was the operational tempo that preceded it. The English kingdoms were not militarily naive. The Anglo-Saxon feared system had real fighting capability, but the ability of Danish forces to appear somewhere unexpected and almost immediately be fortified, fed, and rested scrambled the response time of defenders working within a slower organizational framework. By the time a local ealdorman had gathered his men and marched toward the reported location of the enemy, the Danes had already eaten, slept, posted watches, and were either dug in or gone. There is also a persuasive argument that a Norse force establishing a camp in hostile territory was making a deliberate statement. The earthwork, the stake fence, the fires visible at night, all of it communicated something to the surrounding population. We are here, we are organized, and we intend to stay until we choose to leave.
It demoralized local resistance before any fight happened. It demonstrated that this was not a disorganized mob. It was a force that had done this before and would do it again. Some of those camps never came down. The Norse long forts along the Irish coast began as temporary military infrastructure. Several became permanent settlements. Dublin began as one of them. The ditch and stake fence thrown up in a few hours on a gray autumn afternoon could, if the conditions held, become the foundation for something that outlasted everyone who built it. When you look at the thumbnail for this video, a Norse warrior sitting in a partially constructed camp, the cold ground around him, dark sky behind, and the hourglass in his hand marking time that is already running out, what it captures is not the romance of the Viking Age. It captures the weight of it, the exhaustion behind the competence. The man is not celebrating a raid. He is sitting at the end of the work in a camp that exists because he and the men around him built it with their hands, under time pressure in foreign ground. That is closer to the historical reality than almost anything else the popular image of the Norse warrior tends to show. The longship was extraordinary. The fighting capability was real. But what let Norse armies operate across such vast distances in so many different environments across so many decades was this: the ability to stop, build, defend, eat, sleep, and do it all again the next day. The camp was not a pause between the interesting parts. The camp was where the campaign was actually won or lost. A force that cannot shelter itself cannot fight. A force that cannot feed itself collapses. A force that cannot defend itself while it rests gets killed in its sleep. The Norse armies of the 9th and 10th centuries solved all three of those problems with remarkable consistency, using methods that were low-tech, labor-intensive, and absolutely proven. The 3 hours were not magic. They were the output of a warrior culture that had organized its entire physical competence around a single practical question: how do we survive tonight so we can fight tomorrow? The answer was built out of turf and timber and rope and fire, thrown up before the light failed and left standing until there was somewhere better to be. If the logistics of medieval military life reach you the way they reach me, the practical intelligence hidden in history that the dramatic version always skips over, there's more of that in the videos around this one.